Specter. "I only trust Specter," said the wounded admiral, pointing at the nurse entering the room. The heart monitor screamed before anyone understood what was happening. 1 second, Admiral Thomas Whitaker was lying unconscious in a trauma room at a military hospital in San Diego, California, surrounded by doctors who had spent decades saving lives. The next second, his eyes snapped open, his blood pressure crashed, and every machine around him seemed to erupt at once. Nurses rushed toward the bed while surgeons shouted orders, but the wounded admiral lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward the doorway. His voice was barely more than a breath, yet every person in the room heard it clearly: "Specter. I only trust Specter." And standing in that doorway was a nurse nobody important seemed to remember. If you believe kindness can change a life, that people deserve second chances, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the greatest strength, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us never to judge a person before knowing what they have survived. Her name was Rebecca Carter, but almost nobody at the hospital called her that. To most of the staff, she was simply Specter. It was a nickname she had earned years earlier, not because she was mysterious by choice, but because she seemed to appear whenever someone was hurting and disappear before anyone could thank her. She worked the night shift, took the difficult assignments nobody wanted, and rarely complained. She was 34 years old, had dark brown hair usually tied behind her head, and carried an old silver medical pendant around her neck that had belonged to her father. Rebecca had once been considered one of the most promising emergency nurses in her region, but something had happened years earlier that changed the way people looked at her. A mistake during a chaotic emergency had cost a patient precious time, and although the investigation eventually cleared her of intentional wrongdoing, Rebecca never forgave herself. She transferred to a military hospital, refused promotions, and quietly rebuilt her life one patient at a time. That night, however, she had no idea her past was about to collide with the most important patient she had ever treated. Admiral Whitaker had been injured during a classified training operation off the California coast. His helicopter had suffered catastrophic damage before making an emergency landing, and the admiral had arrived at the hospital with internal bleeding, fractured ribs, a damaged lung, and a serious abdominal injury. His condition was so unstable that 3 surgeons were already preparing to take him into emergency surgery. Among them was Dr. Jonathan Hayes, one of the hospital's most respected trauma surgeons. He was confident, experienced, and accustomed to being obeyed. He had no patience for hesitation, especially when a patient's life was disappearing by the minute. Rebecca entered the room carrying a tray of emergency supplies. She had been called because the admiral's oxygen saturation was dropping. She moved quickly, checking the 4 lines and scanning the monitor while everyone else focused on the obvious injuries. Then she noticed something strange. The pressure in his chest was changing, but not in the way the doctors expected. She looked at his pupils, checked the position of his neck, and then noticed a faint discoloration spreading along his abdomen. She immediately suspected a complication that could turn a difficult operation into a fatal one. But before she could explain, Dr. Hayes ordered another medication. Rebecca hesitated. It was only for a second, but in a trauma room, 1 second could feel like an eternity. She stepped forward and quietly warned that the medication might worsen the problem she was seeing. Dr. Hayes dismissed the concern. He had treated hundreds of cases like this, while Rebecca was only a nurse. She stepped back, but something in her expression remained unsettled. Then Admiral Whitaker's fingers moved. His eyes opened halfway. He looked around the room as if searching through a nightmare. Several faces surrounded him, but his gaze stopped when he saw Rebecca. His breathing became uneven. He raised his hand with enormous effort and pointed directly at her. "Specter," he whispered. Everyone froze. The admiral swallowed painfully and repeated the words that would change everything: "I only trust Specter." Nobody understood what he meant. Dr. Hayes looked at Rebecca as though she had suddenly become a suspect. The nurses exchanged confused glances. Rebecca herself appeared stunned. She stepped closer to the bed and asked the admiral to stay calm, but his eyes remained fixed on her. Then he whispered something that made her blood run cold. He remembered her. Years earlier, before Rebecca had ever worked at the military hospital, she had treated a severely injured young Marine during an emergency evacuation. The Marine's name had been Michael Whitaker. He was the Admiral's son. He had arrived unconscious, bleeding heavily, and close to death. Rebecca had been the nurse who stayed beside him through the night. She had made a critical decision that saved his life, but because of a chaotic documentation error, the official report had never fully recognized what she had done. Rebecca had never told anyone. She had simply walked away from the experience believing she had failed him. Admiral Whitaker remembered something different. His son had survived and later told his father about the nurse who refused to leave his side. He had called her Specter because she had moved silently through the trauma ward, appearing whenever he needed help. The Admiral had spent years trying to find her, but by the time he learned her name, Rebecca had already disappeared from that hospital. Now she was standing beside his bed again. The situation deteriorated quickly. The Admiral's blood pressure fell dangerously low. His abdomen became rigid, and the monitor began showing signs of another internal complication. Dr. Hayes ordered everyone to prepare for immediate surgery. Rebecca looked at the monitor, then at the Admiral, and finally at the surgical team. She knew something was wrong with the original diagnosis. She remembered the same pattern from years earlier, a pattern most people might overlook because the symptoms appeared unrelated. She spoke again, this time with greater confidence, explaining what she believed was happening. Dr. Hayes finally stopped. He asked her what she would do. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She looked at Admiral Whitaker and saw not a powerful military officer, but a frightened father who had just recognized the person who had once saved his son's life. She explained the procedure she believed would stabilize him before surgery. It was risky, but allowing the condition to continue would be worse. The room went silent. Then Dr. Hayes gave her permission. For the next several minutes, Rebecca worked with extraordinary focus. She directed supplies, monitored the Admiral's response, and caught subtle changes before they became emergencies. She did not behave like someone seeking recognition. She behaved like someone who had learned, painfully, that every second mattered. The treatment began working. The Admiral's blood pressure slowly improved. The oxygen level stabilized. For the first time that night, the room became quiet. The surgery followed soon afterward. Hours passed. Rebecca remained outside the operating room, sitting alone beneath the harsh hospital lights. She stared at the silver pendant around her neck and remembered the patient she had lost years before. She remembered the accusation, the investigation, the sleepless nights, and the decision she had made afterward to stop believing she deserved a better life. She had spent years thinking her mistake was the only thing that defined her. Then the operating room doors opened. Dr. Hayes walked toward her. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he removed his surgical cap and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Respect. He told her the Admiral had survived. More importantly, the surgical findings had confirmed Rebecca's warning. If the team had followed the original plan without correcting the complication first, the Admiral probably would not have survived the operation. Rebecca closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. Later that morning, Admiral Whitaker woke in intensive care. He was weak, connected to machines, and unable to move without pain. Rebecca entered quietly to check his medications. He looked at her and smiled faintly. He didn't need to say much. The message was already understood. The woman who had once believed she was nothing more than her worst mistake had just saved the life of the man whose son had once survived because of her. But the most emotional moment came when the Admiral reached for her hand. He told her that his son had never forgotten her. Michael had spent years saying that one nurse had treated him like a human being when everyone else treated him like a number. Rebecca tried to tell him that she had only been doing her job, but the Admiral shook his head. He told her that saving someone was not always about performing a miracle. Sometimes it was about staying when everyone else was ready to walk away. Those words broke something open inside Rebecca. For years, she had believed she needed to earn forgiveness from everyone around her. That morning, she finally understood that perhaps the person she needed to forgive was herself. Weeks later, Admiral Whitaker walked out of the hospital using a cane. Rebecca happened to be working near the entrance when he stopped. Several senior officers stood nearby, but the Admiral ignored them and walked directly toward her. He shook her hand and thanked her, not as an admiral thanking a nurse, but as one human being thanking another for giving him another chance to see tomorrow. Rebecca watched him leave through the glass doors. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt alive. And sometimes, that's what a second chance really looks like. It isn't a grand celebration. It isn't applause or medals. Sometimes it's simply the moment you realize your worst day does not get to decide the rest of your life. Rebecca had spent years believing she was defined by one mistake, but one wounded admiral reminded her that her life was defined by every person she refused to abandon afterward. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these emotional stories reach people who may need a little hope today. And before we end, comment "second chances" below if you believe no one should be defined forever by their worst mistake. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who will save you when nobody else can. And sometimes the person who thinks they have lost everything is actually standing at the beginning of a new life. Rebecca Carter entered that hospital room as a forgotten nurse carrying an old wound. She walked out of it as someone who finally understood her own worth. And somewhere in that hospital, the nickname Specter no longer meant a woman who disappeared into the shadows. It meant the woman who stayed.